From 1865 to 1905, the United States had experienced a surge of industrial growth, known as the Second Industrial Revolution. During this time era, new technological advancements in manufacturing and transportation changed the lives of many Americans. For example, in the 1850s, two men by the name of Henry Bessemer and William Kelly developed a faster way to make steel. With this process, known as the Bessemer process, American steel production went from 15,000 tons in 1865 to more than 28 million tons by 1910. With the mass production of steel, industries such as the railroad industry and construction industry began using steel to replace iron rails or frames. Also, with the growing demand for cheap fuel, Edwin C. Drake drilled for oil using a steam engine near Titusville, Pennsylvania. People considered him crazy for thinking he would find oil, but as it began to flow out, other wildcatters scrambled to dig up their own oil. Refineries found a way to develop oil into other petroleum products, and a runaway slave by the name of Elijah McCoy invented a lubricating cup that allowed oil to be fed into parts of a machine while it was still running. In 1869, the country's first transcontinental railroad was completed. It was completed when the Central Pacific and Union Pacific railroads were linked. It ran from Omaha, Nebraska to the Pacific Ocean. With the growth of the railroad, western settlement increased due to the cheap cost of traveling. Towns sprang up near railroads and many existing towns became big cities. The railroad company needed steel to produce rails for railroads, so they invested a lot of money in the steel company. New advancements in railroad cars, such as refrigerated freight cars for example, helped business development in the meat company business. With railroads, companies can now sell their products around America. Advancements in communication also impacted Americans' lives by making communication easier. The invention of the telegraph allowed people to communicate through a dot-dash code over wires with electricity in a matter of minutes. The typewriter allowed people to produce documents. It made communication with people around the world much easier than it was before. With the national economy growing, many big businesses sprang up. The idea of laissez-faire capitalism was supported by business leaders due to the high regard for self-reliance. This meant that the government could not interfere in the economy. They thought if the government interfered, it would diminish the self-reliance and the success of an individual. The idea of social Darwinism was embraced by business leaders because they thought society progressed through natural competition. Only those who were fittest would rise to power and wealth. Those who were unfit would fail. With the economic climate of the late 1800s, corporations needed more than just organizational stability to compete with the prices and profits that rose and fell uncontrollably. These corporations formed trusts. This meant that they controlled all of the companies as a single enterprise. This reduced competition, and if these trusts gained complete control of an industry, it held a monopoly. This would mean that the company would have complete control and have no competition or very little, making it quite powerful. One of the big business leaders of the time was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie invested in stock in big numbers such as railroads, oil, iron, bridges, and telegraph lines. In the 1850s, he entered the steel business and reduced the production cost of steel. He bought supplies in bulk and produced large amounts of goods so he could sell them for a lower price. He owned the monopoly and called his company the Carnegie Steel Company. His company dominated the steel industry, and he retired in 1901 as the richest man by selling his company for $500 million. Carnegie was also a caring man who donated more than $350 million to charity so that the poor could better their lives and be successful one day. Another big business leader was John D. Rockefeller. He owned a small oil refinery industry but wanted to get control of the whole oil industry. Rockefeller bought out companies that contributed to each part of oil refining, such as barrel factories, oil storage facilities, and oil fields. By owning these companies, he sold oil cheaper than his competition. If he was unable to buy an oil refinery, he controlled it by forming a trust. The Standard Oil Company controlled about 90% of the country's oil by 1880 and was a multinational company. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller donated money to many charities and schools. Throughout his life, he donated about $550 million to humanitarian causes. Some other giants of industry at the time were Cornelius Vanderbilt, George Westinghouse, and George Pullman. These individuals became wealthy from the railroad industry, and George Pullman was the most successful of the three. Labor was needed everywhere in the United States. People were needed to work in factories, build railroads and buildings, and for many other things. Since there were many immigrants coming into the U.S. and many in need of a job, workers were disposable. If a worker wasn't keeping up, they could be fired and replaced by another worker. The workers were paid low wages and worked long hours. Many workers were killed or injured in their workplace since there was no regulation of safety. Children worked as well because their families needed the money. Working conditions in the factories was awful as well. Many factories were unsanitary and dangerous for workers. With the U.S. population growing, people had more needs. They felt the need to socialize and the need for better economic opportunities. They wanted a fresh start, so they began urbanizing and changing their lifestyles. Cities became megalopolises and very ethnically diverse. Living in these areas wasn't pleasant, however. There were many crowded families living in a small building and different class distinctions living in the metropolitan area. Poor food sources led to disease and people dying in the cities. Since there was no garbage disposal service, people never disposed of their trash properly, leaving it to gather outside their homes. Horses' droppings were left there to decompose, and all the trash on the roads was never picked up. Violence plus crime amplified, however. There were many new cultures in these areas. The urban areas turned into slums with the upper class leaving, yet cities became larger and buildings became bigger. Jobs were easier to find in these urban areas, and for some, these living conditions were better than where they came from. Before the Gilded Age, only the wealthy lived in these urban areas. There were no poor people living in the cities or class distinction. They usually lived in the outskirts of the cities. Cities were more organized and sanitary. There were also less crime rates and a small percent of ethnicity difference. With these new people urbanizing, the wealthy seemed to steer away from cities and go to rural areas. Since the United States was viewed as a country for opportunity and a new life, many immigrants came rushing in. Many immigrants came from different parts of Europe and a few from Asia and Canada. About 2.2 million came from Ireland, 4.1 million from Italy, 7.8 million from Russia, 2.9 million from Britain, and 500,000 from China, and 1.7 million from Canada between the years of 1870 and 1920. In total, about 22 million people migrated to the United States during this time period. There are many push-pull factors that cause an individual to want to migrate. Some individuals find another country to have better economic opportunities and environmental opportunities than the country that they currently reside in. People are pushed away from the area in which they reside in due to not having a job, dealing with laws that don't allow them to practice their religion, living in poor conditions, or all the natural disasters that occur often. These individuals are then pulled to an area where they can be happy and enjoy life, an area that well suits their needs, such as getting a job, to afford a decent home, and being free to practice their religion. This surge in population provided the nation with workers. Factories didn't have to worry about needing workers because there was a steady supply of them. These new people brought with them the customs of their old country. They also brought new cultures from different parts of the world. The United States was a country that had different types of races and cultures. With more people rushing to the United States, more jobs became available as well. Not all Americans liked this, however. Some nativists hated foreigners and wanted them to go back to where they came from. These Americans wanted to stop immigrants from entering the United States. Thus, the Immigrant Restriction League was formed by wealthy Bostonians who wanted to force the literacy test on all immigrants. On the other hand, those who were for immigrants said they made positive impacts to American society. Without them, it would have been impossible for the United States to industrialize as rapidly as they had in the 1800s. During the Gilded Age, many inventions and the surge of immigrants helped the United States grow into a powerful nation. Transportation allowed things to be transported all over the states rapidly. With immigrants coming from different parts of the world, the United States was able to industrialize rapidly. The life in the city provided many people with jobs and a better lifestyle than where they were before. Food and other goods were produced more efficiently. Not everything had a positive impact, however. Many urban areas became the slums when many lower class people moved in and the upper class seemed to leave toward rural areas. Diseases spread in the cities, and working in the factories was both unsanitary and dangerous. However, this change helped establish the United States as a world power. If it wasn't for many immigrants filling in the labor force, the United States would have never been able to industrialize as rapidly as it had. As the population grew, so did the national economy. With the United States producing goods at a faster and surplus rate, it was able to build up a strong economy. For many, the United States was viewed as a place for hope and new beginnings.